Try this again. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my talk on integrating sexual orientation and gender identity considerations into foreign policy and international assistance programming using Canada as a case study. So my name is Graham Robertson. I use he and him pronouns, and I describe myself as an independent researcher, activist, and policymaker based in Toronto, Canada. Just a note on terminology, I'll be using the acronym LGBTQIA to describe the community. For those who aren't familiar, the two represents or accounts for Two-Spirit people, which is a culturally specific term used by some Indigenous communities in Canada and the United States with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And I'll note in my presentation later on that it is very fundamental to account for the different cultural terms that sexual and gender minorities use to describe themselves and the importance of respecting and affirming those terms in order to uphold their own autonomy. So an overview of what I'll be chatting about today. So I'll introduce myself, a bit more of who I am, what I do, and how I came to this topic before moving into the topic itself. A bit of the methodology and the literature behind the research. And then moving into the government of Canada as a case study, sort of the evolution from a conservative to liberal government and the mid-2010s, challenges and opportunities that arose with that shift. And then a bit of a case study of Canada's engagement with grassroots organizations and local organizations, particularly in global South countries. And finally, share some takeaways and pose some questions for consideration to inform future developments in this field of study. So a bit about me, as I mentioned, I describe myself and my work as sitting at the nexus of policy, research, and advocacy. And I am particularly interested in the role of civil society organizations and activists in developing inclusive public policies. So for me, I don't believe that policy should be unilaterally developed by stodgy bureaucrats sitting in a class or office. I think it's fundamental that those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. I don't remember who said that, forgive me. But those with lived experiences should really be the ones informing social policy and foreign policy development. So in 2019, 2020, I did my master's in human rights and politics at the LSE. And my course content focused primarily on grassroots advocacy and campaigning, the role of human rights NGOs and intergovernmental organizations, as well as a heavy focus on sexuality and gender studies courses, and amalgamating all of those courses together, and the content kind of drew me to this particular topic. And so what I'll be presenting today is essentially my master's thesis from the LSE. I have experience volunteering with different community organizations with a focus on queer and trans rights, racial justice issues, and youth issues, and drawing from my own lived experiences. So I spent about half a decade in the Canadian capital, where I was very close to a lot of that, I guess, advocacy work, both at my university campus as well as Parliament Hill. And then I later took that experience to some of the work that I did when I was in London, and then also with community organizations in Toronto, as well as some of the talks that I did on these topics, both in Canada as well as last fall at the Interfaith Conference in Mexico. So I guess the queer, trans, racial justice, and youth issues are my areas of interest, and I don't want to say expertise because I'm not an expert on anything, but what I'm particularly interested in. As well, I have a policy background with the Government of Canada, particularly in health and social policy, but I just want to flag that I'm here independently, not on behalf of the government. And so what I'll be sharing today does not represent the views of the government itself. My work is not affiliated with them, but rather just, again, sharing my own research and lessons learned from my master's thesis. And so with that disclaimer, the research was conducted in 2019 to 2020, and I was very deliberate about not updating the research beyond the summer of 2020 when I completed the study, simply because this presentation is not intended to be sort of a formal policy document, but rather using lessons learned to develop kind of a conceptual framework for understanding promising practices for developing SOGI inclusive foreign and international assistance policies. And really interested to learn for those who either have experience in government or are privy to that work, other best practices or promising practices from other states involved in these areas. So the topic overview, I guess while I was sitting in my sexuality and gender studies courses at the LSE, there was this loose narrative of Canada as a global leader on international LGBTQIA rights, and as the only Canadian in the course with sort of lived experience of seeing how the government has done this work domestically and internationally, I was inspired to interrogate that narrative and kind of think about what Canada has done well, but also the limitations and opportunities for future developments, particularly looking through this topic through the lens of sexual citizenship, this idea of who gets rights under which context, but more importantly, who is excluded from advancing rights, particularly through foreign and international assistance policies. At the time that I was doing this research, so 2019 to 2020, we were about 4 to 5 years into the Liberal government's mandate, essentially. And so there wasn't a whole lot of literature published on the Trudeau government's work on international LGBTQIA rights. And so I thought it would be opportune for me to start some of that research for myself. There was a fair amount published around what the previous Conservative government in Canada had done on international LGBTQIA rights, some good, some bad. And so I was interested as well to know sort of whether political will, as well as the approach taken on queer and trans rights, is contingent on which party is in office, right? Right now in the UK, as well as in many states across the US, we're seeing a rollback of queer and trans rights under Conservative leadership, and also at the provincial level in Canada as well. And so from an activist perspective, interested to think about kind of how queer and trans activists can push their governments, regardless of who's in power, to effectively work on these rights domestically and internationally. What I saw through my research, moving from a conservative to liberal government, was the development of a strategic diplomatic approach. So not necessarily making aggressive, overt statements in public fora, but rather working more through backdoor methods and using more of a, I guess, private bilateral approach between states. And I'll chat about that a bit more during our presentation. And so that's kind of one of the early successes, or not early successes, but one of the early things that we shared with you through my research. And the benefits of the strategic diplomacy is that it really foregrounds, or perhaps is more considered about the lived experiences of civil society, because when you are making these aggressive statements as a government, oftentimes what happens is that the recipient government will retaliate against their own community if foreign aid is cut, or if a government is humiliated by another state on the world stage, they'll in turn take it out on members of their community. But when this diplomacy is done a bit more strategically, it considers kind of the impacts of these diplomatic efforts on communities on the ground. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of civil society being consulted in the development of these policies and the impacts of these policies on civil society. My methodology, so a bit of how I conducted my research. So I took a qualitative approach, combining various forms of literature, so academic articles published by scholars working in queer theory, sexuality and gender studies, as well as political science, with news reports and NGO reports, for example, by Human Rights Watch, as well as policy documents, particularly by the Government of Canada. So noteworthy, their feminist international assistance policy and feminist foreign policy. And I combined the literature with some interviews. So I did 7 semi-structured audio interviews and 1 structured email interview. And my respondents were Canadian LGBTQIA civil society actors and academics, Canadian government officials, so both on the political side, but also the civil servant bureaucrat side, and then queer and trans civil society actors from the UK, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, and Ecuador, the latter three of which were organizations that had received some kind of funding or resources from the Canadian government. So I do have to share a bit of the, I guess, literature around how I got to this topic to contextualize the issue. So forgive me if it's a bit dry. So starting with this idea of sexual citizenship. So citizenship first is status afforded to members of a community with a guarantee of rights established through a relationship between the individual and the state. So I want to hold on to that term of guarantee of rights because it's not always the case that these rights are in fact guaranteed and given. So moving one step further, sexual citizenship could be described as the negotiation of one's rights on the basis of one's sexuality and for the purposes of the research, gender identity and gender expression. So sexual citizenship involves sexual and gender minorities articulating a sense of belonging to a group on the basis of SOGI and ensuring equal protections as a result of this group membership. So I see sort of three tiers of these protections. So the first is freedom from discrimination. So for example, we see this in things like the Charter, the Canadian Human Rights Act in Canada. So freedom from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, among other protected characteristics. The second tier would be sort of this equalizing tier. So one example would be equal marriage, for example. If heterosexual people are allowed to get married, why can't same-sex couples? And then the third tier is sort of additional necessary guarantees to affirm and uphold one's identities. So that could be, for example, certain forms of healthcare or gender-affirming care to ensure that, that folks have the resources that they need to live their full authentic selves. As I mentioned, this guarantee of rights does not always take place. And so when a state fails to grant rights to sexual or gender minorities, the negotiation of rights may occur in other spaces, including social movements, NGOs, or international human rights organizations. So one example could be if the state fails to provide, I guess, accessible forms of healthcare, for example, NGOs may provide certain resources or funding to support queer individuals with accessing this form of care. Other governments can also play a role if the state fails to act. And so this can take place through intergovernmental forums such as the UN. So we can think about certain declarations or coalitions between governments or the work of the independent expert on SOGI, for example. Or this work can take place through direct intervention. And when I say intervention, I'm not talking about like military intervention, but rather sort of these bilateral private conversations that can take place between heads of state or foreign ministers. Or when I say direct intervention as well, it can also be sort of local missions in the country working strategically to support grassroots organizations. Now, Mark alluded to this in his keynote this morning, that intervention, while oftentimes well-intentioned, may not necessarily be received well. And so oftentimes it's Western or global North states that conduct a lot of this foreign intervention on human rights or on LGBTQIA rights in particular. And these states have been very vocal about these rights in international forums. So two examples outside of Canada would be, for example, former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the UN Human Rights Council making the speech that gay rights are human rights. And similarly, former UK Prime Minister David Cameron tying UK aid to a country's treatment of queer and trans populations. Again, while well-intentioned, these interventions have not always been well received. So in response to Secretary Clinton's gay rights or human rights statement, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni cautioned the US to solve their own problems first before lecturing other countries, which to his credit has some truth to it, because if you think about what's happening in the UK, in the US, some parts of Canada, like the situation is not perfect by any means for queer and trans populations, particularly the trans community. And yet these countries feel very emboldened to sort of go on the world stage and advocate for queer and trans rights abroad. And so we really need to be cautious about how these statements produce narratives and reproduce narratives of a supposed progressive global north and a unilaterally homophobic and regressive global south. Obviously, that is not the truth and not accurate to the actual countries or to these countries themselves. Homophobia exists, homophobia and transphobia and biphobia exist across cultures, communities, and continents. And it's particularly important to think about sort of these statements in the context of European colonialism, right? A lot of the homophobia that exists in global South countries and former colonies exists because of British colonialism or other European colonialism. And many of these colonial era laws are still in place today. Thinking about my own country, Canada, for example, like the impacts of British and French colonialism on Indigenous populations and the ways in which Indigenous peoples were forced to give up their own diverse sexual orientations and gender identities in favor of sort of the civilized way to exist. Another point that came up during my research was that not all who engage in same-sex behavior or who have diverse sexual orientation, diverse gender identities and gender expressions identify with the queer and trans community. Not everyone uses terms like gay or transgender. Not to say, of course, that these terms are singularly Western terms, but there are other languages used. I talked about, for example, Two-Spirit as a term used by some Indigenous populations in Canada. And so when these interventions take place, it's paramount that the intervening country respects and affirms and upholds the languages and identities used by local populations and ensures that their interventions are culturally sensitive. So now we'll move into Canada's approach, looking at some of the successes, I don't want to say failures, but rather opportunities for future development, and thinking about particularly this shift from a conservative to liberal government. So some, I guess, historic interventions. Some of Canada's work goes as far back as 1995 on the international scale. So at the Fourth World Conference on Beijing, countries were working on a statement that upheld the sexual autonomy of women. And Canada was one of the countries that really pushed for sexual orientation to be a protected characteristic in the statement. So essentially ensuring that lesbian and bisexual and queer women were included in the statement on women's sexual autonomy. As well, in 2006, Canada was one of the countries really pushing for the Yogia Carta principles, which enshrine SOGI in international law. And in more recent years, Canada has been commended for its work on queer and trans rights in the Commonwealth. So these bilateral conversations between states, many of which are still reeling from the impacts of British colonialism, as well as for supporting queer and trans refugees. And under the current Liberal government, Canada has very vocally expressed its support for queer and trans rights in a positive way, not necessarily in that admonishing way or in that lecturing way, but what we'll see is that while vocal support is welcome, it has to be backed up by resources and capacity and actually funding. Money is kind of the most important thing in many cases for communities. So I talked a bit about the shift from a conservative to liberal government. Like in many countries, queer and trans rights were deemed as an uneasy fit for the previous conservative government, which ended in 2015, as contrasted with a very different party context when the Liberals came into power in 2015, which suggests, of course, a strong politicization of queer and trans rights. And for activists and policymakers in the room, for activists, how can we ensure that governments continue to advance these rights, I guess, after an election takes place? In Canada, it is very likely that there may be conservative government coming into power, in the next couple of years. And so for many activists in the country, thinking about how to put queer and trans rights on the agenda for the next government. When the previous conservative government did take measures on international queer and trans rights, they were not necessarily welcome or useful, as one interview respondent described, and they were criticized for their aggressive approach, which I'll get to in a moment. But at the same time, the liberals have been criticized for signaling, virtue signaling, as some call it, support for queer and trans rights without sufficient funding, institutional capacity, or for fully integrating SOGI into Canada's so-called feminist foreign policy and feminist international assistance policy. And so really thinking about sort of beyond statements, what is the substance needed to actually advance these rights abroad? So one of the, I guess, lessons learned from this shift from a conservative to a liberal government was the development of this strategic diplomatic force. So in 2012, Canada's then conservative foreign minister, John Baird, was very harshly criticized for admonishing Uganda's former anti-homosexuality bill. He did this in a very public forum amongst other world leaders, and the foreign minister's actions were described as remarkably undiplomatic and actually a low point in Canada's foreign policy. Certainly, it's important to speak out against homophobic legislation, but it's important to be careful and cautious about the approach that a country is taking when doing this. As I mentioned earlier, for example, because of the impacts that these statements can have upon civil society groups in the country that is at the receiving end of these statements. In contrast, however, the Liberal Trudeau government has been a lot more deliberative and cautious in how it advances queer and trans rights in multilateral fora. So it takes more of a sort of backdoor private approach, having more of these bilateral private conversations between foreign ministers or world leaders. Very recently, for example, Prime Minister Trudeau had a conversation with Italy's, Prime Minister or President, on their treatment of queer and trans populations. But overstatements have also been made when necessary. And one of the best ways to do this, for example, is if other countries are taking sort of a coordinated approach in speaking out against these statements, whether through written statements or online statements, for example, so that they aren't necessarily humiliating the recipient country in front of their peers on the world stage. My intention here is not to unilaterally criticize conservative governments. I mean, we are seeing a rollback of queer and trans rights under right-wing leadership, but there can be allies within these parties in certain cases. And my intention as well is not to portray liberal governments as perfect, but rather to demonstrate this one lesson learned from Trudeau government's tenure and the importance of a strategic diplomatic force. So now I'll talk a little bit about Canada's engagement with grassroots organizations. And so I spoke with 3 organizations that had received funding or otherwise some sort of support from Canada in Kazakhstan, Malaysia, and Ecuador. So during my interviews, some of the common themes that emerged were sort of an appreciation by Canada for local norms within these communities, respecting cultural norms, and supporting activists to lead their own advocacy efforts, for example, through funding or resources to build the capacity of these organizations, private training with regards to employment, refugee resettlement, or legal aid services. And so this is an example of strategic diplomacy at play, because it wasn't the case that Canada was going into these countries and telling and lecturing their governments, this is how you should treat your populations, but rather whether at headquarters or the local missions were supporting activists within these countries to lead their own advocacy efforts. But also Canada was gently nudging these governments when necessary. One of the lessons learned that came up during my research as well was that while it is certainly important and necessary to highlight the distinct discrimination faced by queer and trans populations and speak out in favor of and work towards advancing LGBTQIA rights, sometimes it is actually more optimal and effective to mainstream SOGI considerations into more, I guess, favorable rights agendas. So for example, when I was speaking with a women's rights organization in Kazakhstan, they talked about the ways in which they integrated SOGI into their broader women's rights agenda. So accounting for the rights of women and all their diversity. So queer and trans women in their broader work around gender equality. This can also be seen, for example, like access to healthcare or economic development, right? Like every country wants an economically advanced, healthy population. And if you can shoehorn queer and trans issues and rights into those more favorable rights agendas, at times it can lead to more impactful outcomes. At the same time, of course, it is necessary to distinctly work on queer and trans rights when necessary. And so that strategic diplomatic voice considers when it is or is not beneficial to mainstream SOGI rights into other rights agendas or to kind of highlight them as a singular rights-based issue. Now, it wouldn't be an academic study without some more critiques. And so I want to talk a bit about the NGOization of activism, which is a topic that came up in one of my courses on international human rights organizations. So the organizations that I interviewed and spoke with kind of embodied practices and languages that very much aligned with these like global North and Western conceptions of sexuality and gender. Again, not to say that gay and trans are exclusively Western terms, but there are other languages, regional languages used in different contexts. And so it's important to think about how we can meet the needs of sexual and gender minorities who don't necessarily use these terms like gay and transgender or identify with the community, but are still facing discrimination within their communities, within their countries, excuse me. These organizations that I spoke with were also very much internationally recognized. So whether it was their executive director having received an award, an international human rights award, or if the organization itself had received some kind of international recognition or awards. And so this really prompted me to think about which organizations intervening governments are willing and able to build relationships with, right? Is it the case that these larger, more prominent organizations are the ones that continue to receive foreign aid and foreign funding, whereas smaller grassroots organizations tend to not have these same relationships and don't receive the same funding. I think this is very much akin to, for example, we can draw parallels to in Western countries like UK or Canada, pride organizations or queer organizations in cities like London or Toronto or New York being favored for funding, whereas rural and remote and northern communities may not have the same relationships with large donors or governments themselves. We can also think about, for example, the administrative burdens that come with receiving foreign aid. So whether it's filling out a long, lengthy foreign aid application, for example. Smaller organizations may not have the skill set or the time capacity or the human resources capacity to dedicate 20, 30 hours on filling out a funding application. They may not necessarily have the know-how to fill out these applications. And so they just lose out on receiving support from foreign governments. And so it's really critical to think about how we can support social movements that don't necessarily fit the typical, I guess, NGO model. Because oftentimes these smaller organizations are in fact the ones in greatest need, but don't have the same relationships and lose out on certain opportunities. All right, so I guess takeaways. So firstly, of course, the need for that strategic diplomatic voice, right? Speaking privately, speaking bilaterally, but being local when necessary, and that can be working in coordination with other governments, your written statements or online. Building institutional capacity, right? So that's twofold. For intervening governments, if they choose to intervene, it's having the human resources capacity within their foreign ministries to actually dedicate sufficient time and energy towards advancing queer and trans rights abroad, particularly when we think about sort of this shift from conservative to liberal or liberal to conservative governments, ensuring that there is political will to work on these issues and also policy will, right, within the ministry itself, ensuring that management sees this as a priority and that they're dedicating funding and time and resources to their employees to not do this work on the side of their desk, but actually take queer and trans rights abroad seriously. And then second side is civil society organizations having appropriate resources to lead their own advocacy. So not being, I guess, reliant on an intervening government to do the work for them. Because if you think about, if a conservative government comes into power and decides not to work on this anymore, the civil society organization will be stranded and they won't have the capacity to do the work themselves. So ensuring that they have the resources and the capacity to do their own efforts in a way that respects their own cultural norms. Third takeaway is mainstreaming queer and trans rights into other rights-based agendas, for example, women's rights or access to healthcare, where appropriate and necessary. So this must be done carefully because firstly, it is necessary to highlight those distinct discrimination faced by queer and trans populations. And secondly, if choosing to mainstream queer and trans rights into other rights-based agendas, for example, women's rights, ensuring that we don't impact progress on these other rights-based agendas. And then finally, addressing the NGOization of activism, right? Thinking about through the lens of sexual citizenship, who qualifies for aid, who is guaranteed rights, who is excluded from these conversations and why. I guess when we think about minority groups, who is the majority within that minority, right? And who continues to be the minority within the minority itself. So that is basically my presentation. I've left a number of discussion questions to sort of prompt your thinking as we look ahead to future developments in this area, but I would love to, I guess, get some of your broader questions or comments or feedback for consideration. And yeah, thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Graham?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure how far to deal with my questions, but if I struggle a bit. I'm really interested in how everything you said here is rooted in the notion of citizenship and that relationship between individual and state. And I know that there's this narrative of conservative and liberal governments and how they construct that notion of their duty to citizens. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on what I think some scholars in various fields across a whole range of disciplines have identified as a complete re-articulation of that relationship in the last 30, 40 years, away from citizenship being a guarantee of freedom from forms of oppression, guarantee of civil rights in the sense that the state will protect you from forms of oppression, and re-articulating that to a freedom to. You're allowed to do what you like, but you can't on your own. We're not going to regulate as much. You can do what you like. And quite often that you can do what you like comes with the caveat of if it has a market logic, if it can be marketized, we provide funding. If you can demonstrate it having an economic worth, we will give you the resources you need. And I think that the resources part of everything you said was quite interesting to me, that governments say a lot of things, but they don't actually allocate a lot of resources, whether that's human resources in terms of time and allocation of workloads, or even just funding. And I wonder if for you, has that ever come up, that there's this problem of, there's this token idea that you can do what you like, and you can develop these NGOs and also get involved in these kinds of rights, but ultimately if it doesn't serve the marks for the economic logic, we won't really sort of put our hand full force in and help out. Does that come up?
I think one of the considerations that I had around like citizenship is this idea of like rights and also responsibilities. Like we'll guarantee you rights, but you also have responsibility to contribute to the state. For example, a lot of the narratives being pushed by conservative leaders in in Canada, for example, and I'm sure in other states as well, is queer and trans populations are great because they contribute X amount to the economy, or they're good for tourism. And that's important, but it's also how are you as a conservative leader promising to protect communities from discrimination, and violence, and harassment? Like, are you only speaking out in favor of queer and trans populations if it serves the state, but you fail to speak out when there is a hate crime, for example, or failing to take anti-trans hate and anti-trans violence seriously in leadership? I don't know what the situation, I mean, in terms of the UK, like I'm aware of a lot of the rollback of rights, but I'm curious, I guess, maybe turning it back to you, if you know sort of what the rhetoric is around sort of by conservative leaders or others in the country around sort of the duty of queer and trans people to contribute to the state and how they are benefited.
I mean, in the UK, at least from my sort of understanding, at least in the time I've been in academia, this isn't contained to one area. It's across a whole range of fields of social life. You know, even in my profession in academia now, that same ultimate question comes up of, does your discipline contribute to economic worth? If it does not, goodbye. You know, and so on and so forth. It's that ultimate question of, are you a worthy, or do you do something that's worthy? And I think the same. I'm not a specialist in LGBTQIA rights in the UK. Drew's in here, certainly be able to speak to that particularly. But I think it's a trend that goes deep, like everywhere. You know, about this notion of economic worth being almost the thing that commensurates who you are and whether you are a worthy person participating in society on a sort of a level of national wealth and so on. And yeah, so I think it would. I think Drew has good examples for you. But the thing that fascinated me about your talk is that idea of citizenship and the freedom from to a sort of freedom to idea of what it means to be a liberal government as well as a conservative government.
Yeah, and we see this with not just queer and trans populations, but other minority groups as well. I think in Canada and the US, there has been this stereotype over many generations of Indigenous peoples as lazy and taking from the economy because they receive certain forms of welfare that they are entitled to. And conservative leaders describing Indigenous populations as, needing to, pardon my language, but like get their asses up and work, which is totally not the reality, and it really ignores the history of how Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US and other countries were treated for centuries, for generations. So in general, I think across many demographics, there is this belief that citizenship is more of a responsibility than a guarantee of rights, rather than simply saying, we will give these rights to you because it is the right thing to do. So yeah, I thank you for that prompt.
I really like that. The points-based immigration system is a very good example.
Yes, exactly. And who has the money and who are we going to allow into the country because they are educated or wealthy or have some valuable asset.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious if Canada or Global Affairs Canada has tracked the amounts of these targeted funds, and if you can kind of like look at what percentage of their units or even like official development assistance this would be. My assumption is that it's like quite minuscule, but it would be really interesting to know if they even track that to allow that comparison. The second question is, aside from this bilateral support, Canada is also historically and quite recently given to multilateral mechanisms on LGBTI issues, like 4 million Canadian dollars to the World Bank to support its LGBTI work, right? With very little transparency. So a lot of like folks around the world are like, what is this? Like, why would the World Bank need this money when it could be going to groups? And then there was no actual conversation, there was no follow through. It was just like this effort that happened. I'm wondering if you've heard that, can speak to maybe like the challenges that might also come with like support to the multilateral system.
Apologies, but I don't have those numbers. And I actually was from your first question, and I was not aware of the second. I think just in terms of perhaps reflecting on your second question more broadly, it does raise questions again around that sort of NGOization of activism. Like, are we willing to give money towards large institutions that have that are largely bureaucracies, very similar to governments themselves, rather than understanding that communities themselves are in fact in greatest need of this funding, and perhaps, and in most cases, know how to use the funding more effectively to advance their own causes, right? Local communities have the skill set and the awareness to know when and where to give funding to their colleagues, to their peers. So I think that does raise a really important point about, like, is it necessary and useful to give money to multilateral institutions, or is it perhaps more advantageous to, I guess, do the diplomatic work, having conversations in these multilateral institutions, and then the funding should largely be given at the local levels. Apologies if that doesn't even answer your question, but that's just kind of my reflections on my guys for that.
Yeah,
Yeah, we do. We do have a question. Like, I was trying to get online, but I can't get it. Sorry.
Thank you.
So the question is, my question would be how government who see themselves as friendly voices in international LGBTI rights can utilize international institutions in support of international LGBT plus rights. We saw recently the G7 statement that on LGBT rights, first of its kind, for example. What are the other spaces that have incredible, powerful global voices such as the World Bank or the IMF?
I think that follows very nicely from your question around funding versus sort of dialogue and diplomacy. Like, dialogue and diplomacy, in my opinion, or these organizations are best suited for conversations and diplomacy and sort of thinking about the issues themselves, but the funding really should be going locally to the communities. And so I guess to answer this person's question, international institutions may not be the best space for where the funding should be going to, in my personal opinion. And yeah, it should be going largely to communities themselves, thinking about sort of the foregrounding the experiences of civil society first.
I'm just going to add to that and say whether it's a question or statement. I would say like money goes to places where it seems they get the most back from, rather than where it's needed. So maybe call that corrupt, but I would say, would you agree? Or?
I think so. Yeah, and I think as well, when we're, as I mentioned earlier, my intention with this presentation is not to like portray liberal governments as perfect by any means. I think one of the shortcomings of liberal governments is often a reliance or using these international institutions to portray, oh, we're doing something good, we're having conversations, or we're giving money to X institution or X organization. We're very active members of the UN or of the IMF or the World Bank, but not necessarily thinking about whether these are the places where we're getting the best rate of return of investment. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
And it said that it's quite possible that Canada would move back to a conservative government in a few years. I'm quite ignorant to Canadian politics. Why do you think they are going to move from a liberal government back into a conservative government?
The Liberals have been in power, and this is just my, again, speculation. I like to track these polls because I have no life. But anyways, the Liberals have been in power since 2015, so they're very long into their mandate. They've won 2 minority governments in the last 2 elections, and just not doing very well in the polls right now. There is a bit of an appetite for change in Canada, and so there is kind of broad speculation that this may be the last mandate of the Liberals and that the Conservatives may come into power next. But again, this is all just speculation. But with that speculation, of course, from an advocacy and even policymaking lens, as well as sort of how to ensure that these issues continue and stay on the agenda and are addressed thoughtfully and sort of with the same care and attention that they deserve. And going back to your point around citizenship, kind of from a rights agenda, thinking about as queer activists or as people working on queer policy development, kind of one of the ways to put these issues on the agenda is in fact to demonstrate the economic benefits of these communities. Like as sad as it is to say, like it has to come to that, that is one of the angles that may be used by folks working in these spaces to ensure that conservative leadership takes these issues seriously and continues to work on them. Because of, I guess, the benefits to the state of these communities. So that's kind of just my speculation, but also conversations that I have with other political junkies. As I mentioned, I lived in the capital for 5 years, so it was very much in tune to these types of conversations. Always speculating about election outcomes and what's going to happen after election day. Yes.
On the discussion about citizenship, but isn't it really the case that the citizenship concept is what is mobilized within Canada, but in terms of international activity, it's really the human rights discourse, but where it goes beyond human rights is development. So I think it's important to sort of bring in the development concept and sort of explore that, and that addresses some aspects of citizenship, but not others, and it's still it's framed in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. But that does seem an area where Canada might have been quite an early mover. Was the Brown you were citing Stephen Brown? Yes. So maybe in his existing work, he might have commented on sort of development funding from Canada, and certainly that seems to have emerged earlier than the UK on LGBT issues. So generally, it seems to me that Canada is an early mover, and it's interesting to sort of think about the role of LGBTQ organizations like ARC International in Canada, which was very sort of significant, even though quite small, like John Fisher and Kim Vance involved in that, were sort of very active in kind of working internationally in relation to the UN. So I think kind of bringing out that angle and the development angle could perhaps more clearly show the basis for comparison and kind of would reveal that Canada, has been very active and sort of an early mover compared to some other states, which has both sort of costs and benefit.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And certainly international development is one of the biggest avenues in which Canada works on these issues, right? Like leveraging the SDGs and international assistance, international development narrative to its work abroad. When we think about development too, like development on terms, right? Like economic development, but also sort of personal development, I guess. Any final reflections, thoughts? I know we're a couple minutes early.
Sorry.
Yes.
On the Commonwealth, right? So you mentioned the Commonwealth, so you were kind of problematizing the colonial histories, but then in your comment on the Commonwealth, you're saying that Canada has been commended for being a kind of leading voice in the Commonwealth, right? But then, so that is mobilizing the Commonwealth as a political opportunity structure, and that that is a sort of debated, contested issue. One way of looking at what's happened in the Commonwealth is there's been a lot of time and energy put into the Commonwealth by LGBTQ activists, but maybe with quite slim pickings in terms of tangible outcomes. Like civil society forums have made statements that the heads of government themselves have not very directly kind of addressed the LGBTQ issues. So could you maybe say a bit more about how you see the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like when Canada is perceived as a leader on LGBT, or perhaps leading conversations on queer and trans rights in the Commonwealth, it very much reflects sort of that a Western state is for grounding itself as, you know, as progressive, and other states are not as caught up or as advanced as a state like Canada, which reflects the dynamics within the Commonwealth as well, of sort of a progressive global north and a regressive or underdeveloped global south. Certainly not the most accurate perception, particularly when you think about the fact that a lot of the colonial era law or anti-queer laws in some of these countries are colonial era laws. So I think that's